Hey, what's going on, guys? Meteorologist Jonathan Kegas with you, hanging out with meteorologist David Nazario. What's going on, buddy?
Oh, not much. How you doing this evening?
Doing pretty well. We are having some fun tonight. He is, if you're unaware, WKMG News 6's newest meteorologist, and we are on the collab tonight to talk about tropics, the first of many, my friend.
Exactly. Very, very many. Hopefully, if we can get the 2024 hurricane season to finally cooperate. It looks like we're still in a very sensitive, somewhat frugal pattern out there, but developmental chances are indeed starting to go up down there in the Bay of Campeche. Not associated with Invest 90L, which is a little bizarre. We have the wrong Invest, more or less, designated out there in the western Gulf of Mexico.
It's a weird one, and I'm going to change the source right now. Looking, I have like 400 tabs open, so I'm finding my chiclet, my right my tab to go, and there we go. There is our weather computer, David.
There we go. Perfect. So this is our area of interest, not the invest that is designated that's been more or less marinating off the coast of Houston for the last 3 to 5 days, associated with a stationary boundary that's draped almost west to east across the Gulf coastline from Texas over here to our neck of the woods in the northern Florida peninsula. It is actually going to be what was once called to become Hurricane Francine by many. And unfortunately, the models suddenly decided to dump all the confidence we had built in this monsoonal tropical disturbance, if you will, as it plugged westward across the MDR into the Eastern Caribbean and then finally just kind of slopped out, if you will. And now it's just a lingering area of disturbed weather that's pushing into the Yucatan right now. But model confidence is once again growing that maybe a broad area of low pressure might try to manifest itself in the Bay of Campeche. And a lot of our globals are indeed showing this.
Yeah, and that's a good point. It has been looking like that before. And show of hands, post in the comments who had seen this being called a hurricane already. That's one of the things that we always talk about and frustrates people like David and I that go out there and just go off of some of these crazy model runs, especially in the environment that we are in, where again, of course, you don't want anything, but we're clearly seeing the Atlantic not being able to sustain any kind of tropical development in this peak season, at least for the next, other than this little homegrown nonsense mixing with that other tropical wave you mentioned, at least for the next week or two.
No, exactly, Jonathan. I fully agree. I'm not too sure we are, for all intents and purposes. Don't misconstrue that, ladies and gentlemen. It's a matter of multiple minute variables that are coming together at just the most unfortunate of timing. We're rapidly approaching the peak of hurricane season. It is September 6th. And climatologically speaking, we know that we hit the top, the northernmost apex, one could say, of the climatological hurricane season peak. And we're looking at homegrown slop, as a lot of us would typically call it. This is very reminiscent of June, maybe early July, before the peak Saharan air layer begins to creep in across the basin. And then as we get ready to conclude Halloween time, approaching Thanksgiving and Black Friday is typically when we turn our attention back towards the Gulf of Mexico, the Western Caribbean, or even off the southeast coast, a la Tropical Storm Ophelia we saw in 2023 last year.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy. It's so far almost flip flopped. I mean, we saw the Cat 5 monster barrel in June. That was no doubt an August, September storm in June. So it's just weird how things are going. And we're getting these fronts to come down into the Gulf Coast pretty early, too. So there's just a lot of weird shenanigans going on as a whole with weather across the northern hemisphere. And we're going to talk more about that a little bit later on in this live stream. We're going to focus, at least for the next few minutes, on this little deal that we have going on in the BOC, the Bay of Campeche. This mix, if you will, David, as you called it before.
Yes, we're looking at a conglomerate of what would typically be something that would form in the likes of June, October, November, as I'd previously mentioned. But the area that looks a little more defined here on our surface winds, this is going to be catered to us by the 12Z European model from earlier this afternoon. You can see that well-pronounced area of low pressure, that cyclonic spin, just to the immediate south of the Louisiana-Texas border there. And that, you would think, is likely to try to manifest itself into our next named system. But unfortunately, unfortunately, National Hurricane Center currently has that zeroed out, 0% chance over the next 48 hours, 0% chance over the next 7 days. It is actually our feature that there, as the model loop continues, transitions off of the Yucatan Peninsula into the Bay of Campeche. And even here, Monday, this is 9 p.m. local time for our neck of the woods here in the Sunshine State, we still don't see much in the way of a pronounced low-pressure system or even a named storm, a tropical storm for that matter. Francine is the next name on the list, as we've already alluded to. So it's
Wait,
a
didn't
very
we see
bizarre
Hurricane
setup.
Francine already? I'm just kidding.
I mean, technically,
that's
we
a joke.
should have,
That's a
but
joke. That is a
we
joke.
were supposed to.
According to some. But anyway, I digress. Sorry, David, continue.
No, absolutely. You're 100% right. There's been a lot of folks, I feel, that have been preparing and forecasting a major hurricane that should have been over there at least 3 to 5 times by now. And we don't want to jump the gun too rapidly in assuming that this will develop. And in fact, for all intents and purposes, this has been such a Daniel Schwartz with a comment there. That is what I had for dinner tonight. Homegrown slop.
Give me that recipe.
Yeah, that summarizes the 2024 hurricane season minus Beryl. And I guess you could argue that Ernesto was fairly well put together, but even Debbie, before making landfall here in the Big Bend of Florida, hardly managed to get itself together. And what we've been emphasizing since before this season started, the record warm waters, the OHC, really didn't do much for us outside of very anomalous record-setting Beryl. So as you can see here, this almost looks very reminiscent of an inverted trough at the very tail end of that frontal system. And if you guys tuned in on Weather Center a couple of days ago when I went live, I believe it was yesterday evening. Was it the day before yesterday? I don't recall. No, it definitely wouldn't have been yesterday evening. It was the evening prior. I'd mentioned that it's going to be a little tough to get a tropical cyclone off the coast of Texas, Louisiana, because of that stationary front, all that continental modified polar air that's still just continuing to funnel off Texas into the upper Gulf coastline there, into the upper Gulf Mexico. However, if we go back to the infrared real quick, Jonathan, I did notice, and I'm looking, I have the shear overlay to my left here as well. You can kind of see in that cloud formation that extends from Guadalupe down there along the border of Texas, Mexico through to our area in Florida, back wrapping around through Miami, Cuba, and into the Yucatan. It does seem like we do have a bit of an anticyclone starting to establish itself, and maybe that's what the models are trying to hint at, that could get that convection getting ready to plop off into the Bay of Campeche to try to spin up.
And the other thing, too, it's always, we saw this with Alberto and Chris. This is one thing we always talk about, too, during homegrown slop season or that Central American gyre season or anything like that. The coastline, the curvature of the coastline always helps to tighten it up at the last second. So even if it's looking a little sloppy once we get there, we either see that right around either the Texas portion or the eastern Mexico portion of that as well. So there's some natural curvature help here with this thing for that last minute tighten up to be classified as a tropical cyclone there. So that'd be something to watch too if we're going to get that extra little tightness, if you will.
Absolutely, I fully agree. In fact, going into the latter half of September and into the first couple of weeks of October, I really would like a lot of us to turn our attention more to the Gulf of Mexico and the Central to Western Caribbean, because I know naturally take them with a grain of salt. Don't put a large amount of confidence into those very long-range extended models, as we've already witnessed. Even our global models out to 3 to 5 days have let us down and left us holding the bag for all intents and purposes with some of these tropical cyclones. And before I fully unravel that or unpack that for you all, ladies and gentlemen, that's another thing too. I've been seeing a lot of, both Jonathan and myself have been seeing a lot of chaos erupting on other social media platforms as a result of this unexpected rapid downtrend in what was forecasted to occur this hurricane season, particularly right about now. If you rewind to 2023, albeit an El Nino hurricane season, I believe we were looking at the likes of a rapidly intensifying Lee shortly after Idalia had made landfall and Franklin bombed out to a major hurricane on its way out of the Caribbean up just along, I believe, the western periphery of Bermuda before finally weakening down and disappearing over the North Atlantic. We were very busy last year, and as we all know, it's pretty much a night and day difference out here for 2024, despite the preseason allegations, the forecast brought to us by official sources. And truthfully, guys, where I'm going with this is cut us just a little bit of slack. Give us forecasters, us meteorologists, the official sources who work hard day and night, literally, as you can see behind me here. It is 9:09 in the evening, working day and night to try to bring you guys as accurate and realistic of this coverage as possible. We can only do so much when the models that are meant to model the atmosphere, as Jonathan has eloquently put it several times, they are not gospel, so we can only work to see into the future as best we can. And when they flip as dramatically as they have been, it leaves us asking the same questions you guys probably are. And I do think if we are to see any tropical development, you can see right here the simulated satellite in the upper winds. We are postured right underneath that anticyclone, which is going to provide that excellent lift, that exhaust, that breathing capacity for whatever this thing decides to manifest itself. I'm still not fully sold on a tropical storm, Jonathan. I'm not sure if you'll agree with me, but we're going to give it another couple days to see whether or not that confidence does go up from our official source, NHC.
Well, and right, there's a lot going on. It's always harder to take something that's broad and tighten it up, too. We mentioned we do have some of the curvature that will eventually help, but we're really kind of smushing together two systems, and they're going to do a little dance and whatever, and they might have... typically, when that happens, they're detrimental to one another. Now, they don't have the strong outflow channels like we're talking about, maybe two tropical storms or two hurricanes doing a Fujiwara-esque deal. But nonetheless, there's not a whole lot of room for these two things to play with each other. You mentioned it, though, with that upper level evacuation zone, so to speak, here with the upper winds aloft, the divergence aloft, that anticyclone, the high pressure on top. Nonetheless, that's why we want to keep everything out of the Gulf of Mexico and Western Caribbean, because I know, and people are mentioning in the comments that B word, the bust word, and believe me, it would take, I think at this point, at least something when I looked up at over the last 20 years, I believe the most active stretch starting from September to the rest of the season was 2020 with, I think, like 18 named storms at that point. I can't remember if it was 2020 or 2005, but it was very, very busy, and we would have to go on a pace faster than that to catch up to get into the middle or higher range of those forecasts. So those are likely, I mean, thankfully not going to come into fruition, but still the low end of those active forecast ranges are still in play if some things change down the line. And again, we talked about this a little bit. We're gonna break that down closer to the end of this live stream. Some craziness that is going on in Africa right now. So stick around for that. You're not going to want to miss it. And while you're waiting for that, I have the Weather Center Nazario page tagged there. Hit that subscribe button, like the pages as well. Subscribe to all. If you want great weather content all year round, that's not going to call a hurricane before it actually happens. There's a lot of that. We don't stand for the garbage and that hype stuff that's out there, and there's a lot of it. And unfortunately, it's for people in the Caribbean islands that may not have the resources to do that. And I feel like those fear tactics are really starting to ramp up for those folks. Unfortunately, that's just a terrible thing.
No, I fully agree, and I think it really just boils down to it from a content creator's perspective. The hurricane season isn't cooperating. We thought by now we'd simply be tracking storm after storm, hunkering down left and right, and now we're more or less grasping at straws, trying to find something to discuss and bring to the table to where it's a matter of not wasting everyone's time. And for those of you who are coming from the Weather Center Nazario page, you know I'm a big believer in that. I'm not going to simply regurgitate the same thing again and again and again, and that's why Jonathan and I agreed to go live tonight, because not only is National Hurricane Center upping our probabilities for development in the Western Gulf of Mexico, but we're starting to see a bit more of that consistency from the German model, the ICON, the GFS being the GFS, despite the bizarre amalgamation of solutions we get for certain tail-end GFS runs. We're seeing some short-term data that does suggest something along the realm of a tropical cyclone, whether it be a named tropical cyclone or a potential tropical cyclone. There is that potential, but as you can see here, Jonathan has overlaid the tropical rainfall totals. I actually built this graphic earlier because the primary takeaway, regardless of development, we've all heard that infamous catchphrase plenty of times over, is going to be the heavy rainfall associated not only with our disturbance that's lifting to the north, but that feature that's already parked down there being suppressed from moving north, south, west, or east in association with our stationary boundary. And that's resulting in pretty gratuitous amounts of precip here. You can see the rainfall totals. I've generalized them to anywhere between 12 to 15 inches, but even just off the coastline there, any little nudge for all of my long-term viewers out there, north or south, could mean the world for our viewers down there in Louisiana, the Texas area that is probably still feeling the effects of Beryl earlier in July, which feels like so long ago since we've had such space between our systems now. And even up into the Florida Panhandle, we've been getting some pretty chaotic thunderstorms. Even yesterday evening, it was a struggle for me to get home from the studio because of the pop-off convection we were still fighting here in Central Florida, thanks to that stationary boundary and that large, robust platform of tropical moisture coming out of the Caribbean and the Western Atlantic.
It's wild. Yeah, we've been popping off. If watching from the Central Florida area or the entire peninsula, it's been a rough go of things. We have high school football games postponed tonight, or at least earlier in the night, because of all the lightning. And I mean, that's your typical sea breeze stuff, but we have all of that extra juice, as you were saying, that's just been pumped right into the peninsula, and it is wild out there. Wanted to bring this up. David put this into the show to kind of show one of the earlier runs, the 12Z. We talked about this in our live stream on Tropics Watch Live on Monday on the Just Weather and clickorlando.com page. And if you're interested, again, David's going to be back on here Monday night as well. We're going to be working Monday night to really go in depth to break it down at 8 p.m. Eastern time. So check that out as well. We're going to be back here. So come with questions if you have anything that festers over the weekend, any burning questions, think about that. But we're going to have you covered all weekend long, of course, as we watch this. But this is from the 12Z run. And what I was going to say is I sometimes forget my thought. Friends don't let friends look at the 18Z GFS, especially whenever even the most robust waves that are rolling off of Africa are like Thanos snapped, gone. It's nuts. So this is 12Z.
We saw that earlier today. It's been very ridiculous. I'm not too sure why. You know, we had a disturbance that is still slated to plop off the shelf of Africa just to the immediate southeast of the CVs, the Cabo Verde Islands out there, a very familiar spot for this time of year. There's the satellite image. You can see just whoppers of tropical waves. As I've mentioned previously over on my channel, these look like the Independence Day spaceships. They're so large and wide with tons of very good thunderstorm activity with them. The first one, however, interacting with a very bizarre upper-level pattern draped across Western Europe, is actually being pulled towards the north, towards the Mediterranean region, so that will likely never escape over Atlantic waters. The second one just upstream there, creeping into the satellite view, was what was forecast with pretty much across the board model confidence to develop into another long track feature, more than likely a fish storm, more than likely one that will for sure miss the Lesser Antilles and everyone further to the west, even Bermuda. But even that now has lost pretty much all of its confidence outside of, I do believe, this afternoon's European model run did continue to show some sort of a weak, disorganized area of cyclonic curvature. Not too sure whether or not that'll warrant a named storm or not. National Hurricane Center hasn't highlighted it yet, but as you can see here, ladies and gentlemen, that is our hurricane season. That is it right there. If either one of those made it over the proper configuration of the main development region in the Atlantic, we would definitely be seeing a total opposite of where we sit right now.
No question about that. And it's just, this is something you see, the telestrator's not working on this slide, but where you see my mouse going nuts here, zooming in, thunderstorm complex like that in that part of the world is basically unheard of. That is right over the desert. And they are seeing this is like the thousands of years, like you're talking about like once in several lifetime event, what is going on. And this could be part of the reason why the hurricane season has been weird. To be clear, we are not rooting for storms. We love that it is nice, and that Q word that we're not going to say to jinx it for everybody watching. But as scientists, as meteorologists, we don't look for excuses. We forecast something, we figure out why it happens. It's not hype. And we didn't put out forecast numbers, by the way. These entities, NOAA, Colorado State, a bunch of other private entities do that as well. And then we just kind of talk about, the ingredients. We also talk about limiting factors, and even with we broke this down several times. With weather, there's no such thing as a slam dunk. And I mean, if and there's a lot of I go on like 4 different points, David, because in the same breath I'm like, okay, we're still only on September 6th. We have a lot of the meat of the season to go. Climatologically, the date is the 10th, of course, for the peak, but really peak season starts August 20th and goes through the mid to late October. Like there's a peak section, not just a peak day.
Exactly. If you're a weather enthusiast, perhaps you pay that close attention to the calendar, but even before really heavily dabbling in tropical meteorology, I always considered back end of August, close to my mother's birthday on the 18th, all the way through to maybe Halloween, especially after the likes of Wilma and Michael in 2018, Wilma being in 2005. I always August through October is synonymous with peak hurricane season. So I know that the chart, the graphic that is always put up with the giant mountainous peak, as the name implies, right in the beginning of September is supposed to signify when our Atlantic activity should be going through the roof. But I would say it's a very easy way to look at it. Just exactly right here, the graphic there, you could really just generalize from mid-August to late October when it is you're likely to see increased amounts of tropical activity. And I believe, Jonathan, earlier, 2021 was also a spectacular example for a backloaded hurricane season that more or less just turned on. Obviously, we're getting close to crossing that threshold as well. It is September 6th, and nothing confident, let alone multiple systems, are not confidently brewing out there across the basin. But just another perfect example. If you look at the timeline for 2021, we did see a rapid sequence of named storms coming together at the very end of that hurricane season. And right now, truthfully, looking at our convectively coupled Kelvin waves, the CCKWs, for those of you who may not be familiar with that, basically those are just pieces of energy that break away from the Madden-Julian oscillation, the MJO, that moves across the planet over the tropics, particularly helps to give us a little oomph in the tropical activity and the moisture, the thunderstorm activity out there. Those waves are expected to start to move back through our neck of the woods across the Atlantic as we get towards the back end of this month and the first 2 weeks, I would say, more or less, of October, before maybe the MJO can finally get itself back into an optimal phase to try to give the Atlantic a gentle nudge in the right direction to give us another named storm or two. And to piggyback off of what Jonathan said earlier, we are by no means rooting for storms. We're just trying to make sense of the hurricane season and provide you guys with the information that you need. And at this point in time, the capital C right there, climatology, stands firm. We should be seeing more storms on the horizon. Right now, confidence is fairly low, but we cannot rule out additional named storms, even if it be a small cluster of 3 to 5 before we start to close up the 2024 season. There will be more. We're still narrowing down when, and I do believe late September, early October should be more or less tropical prime time for the Atlantic to try to give its best shot.
So there you go, David. I wanted to pull that up. You were talking about the MJO and some of that nudge, if you will. So there's the map from Tropical Tidbits to kind of show that green, that rising motion that does enter the Atlantic basin. That is through September 27th right there. And then that's through the first week of October.
There we go. See, and that's something Jonathan and I had a conversation about yesterday, is if you guys rewind some of our own live streams to back into early August, late July, when we were discussing when it is we could start to see a surge in activity, if you guys recall, the values on that upper anomaly chart were very aggressive. We had a powerful standing wave over Africa and the Indian Ocean area, the India Peninsula, and some of us, including ourselves here, have been collaborating behind the scenes, wondering if too much of a good thing became a bad thing for the Atlantic, and we have just far too many good variables that would typically equate to very strong tropical cyclones coming together and almost preventing it, if you will. Too much water, for example, will give you poisoning. Too much hot water, too much instability, too much moisture has dorked up the traditional configuration that would typically provide us with that African easterly wave train, the development in the MDR, whether they push to the north or to the west. And now it seems like we're starting to calm down. So if the science and the theories are sound, we should see a return, whether it be Francine or the following storms thereafter, start to try to pop themselves up as we get towards the end of this month and into October. It's going to be our best chance. After that, I do believe we're going to be getting close to shutting down, closing up shop, and focusing on fall and the holiday season.
Yeah, and that's and that's the thing. You can't fight climatology. You just can't. And we have it, it's coming through. We're getting a lot of questions here about people are saying, is it a bust this year? Okay, you're not going to, and I think April mentioned this before on the live chat, that never call it a bust, because I mean, tell that to the people in Houston, tell that to the people in the Caribbean that had to deal with Beryl and Debbie, of course, a lot of flooding in the Carolinas and through the Panhandle of Florida. But the only time I would ever say the word bust would maybe be bust to the extremely active forecasts on the upper echelon of those numbers. But still, with 6-7 weeks of peak season left, you're talking about you can't let your guard down. In Florida, the sales tax holiday, believe, ends today. So now, if you didn't get to the store, but now is a good time just to make sure your kid is good when it's quiet. You never want to be running through, because the caveat to that, and again, we don't want to get all hypey, but it's good sometimes when you have storms out there, especially when they're out at sea, because it helps to upwell and churn up that cooler water to help the other storms to follow to be weaker. There is a lot of untapped energy. We have record ocean heat content in the Caribbean and in the Gulf of Mexico. So remember, water temperature isn't the only thing that is required. There's a lot of other things that have to come into play. The moisture, the convective pattern working in favor, and limited wind shear, things like that. And too much of one thing, you really can't, it can overwhelm things. So it's very much the Goldilocks play. You can't have too much, too little. It really does have to be just right.
It does, exactly. For those of you who are coming over from the Weather Center channel, I had mentioned to you guys on numerous occasions, and I'm sure Jonathan has echoed the same over on the Just Weather platform, tropical cyclones are very fragile, very sensitive entities, for lack of a better term. They don't enjoy too much of a gradient, too much shear, too little shear, believe it or not, too much of this, too little of that. It's like I've mentioned previously, trying to balance a stack of plates as a waiter running through a crowded restaurant trying to get to the table that you're trying to lay everything out at. And if one small thing bumps into you, everything's going to come crashing down. And right now we have so many different parameters in the overall environment out here in the Atlantic that things just really aren't popping off. But April Claremont, great to see you, by the way. Awesome to have you tuning in tonight. I do fully agree with your comment as well. We've already exceeded the statistics from last year. So to put it into perspective, I will personally stand firm all day, every day, until the day I'm 6 feet under. Forgive me for sounding a little morbid on the stream, but I will stand firm in the fact that it was not the official sources that potentially led us astray this hurricane season. I've had a few of you ask over on my channel, will hyperactive still be used in the future? Is hyperactive even a real thing? And it 100% is an official term, believe it or not. The problem lies in the way other individuals have gotten their hands on it, whether it be genuine weather enthusiasts, other meteorologists who maybe just didn't properly communicate it to their audience, and then other unofficial sources with a camera and a mic who simply think that hyperactive strictly must mean we need 20 named storms across the Atlantic, 5 in the Gulf, 5 in the Caribbean, 10 in the Atlantic Basin to be constituted as hyperactive. Another thing I wanted to once again educate a lot of you on, for those of you watching, analogs. I think analogs have also been manipulated to, again, cause a bit of sensationalism out there in the social media weather sphere, because analogs are not meant to be used as a mirror image of a hurricane season. Oh, shoot, guys, 2005 is an analog, 2020 is an analog.
Yep.
That must mean we're going to have a season very similar to that. No. In fact, it's almost the opposite. What we're using when we look at those analogs is to try to look for pattern recognition. Where was the high pressure? Where was the low pressure? Where was the shear? What was detrimental to our tropical cyclones? What aided in providing us that many tropical cyclones? What looks very similar to this year that is mirrored by other seasons? It's not necessarily the named storm counts by themselves. So I personally, and I'm sure Jonathan will stand in my corner as well, we got to get away from strictly looking at the named storms. That's something we can rack and stack at the end of the hurricane season.
Mm-hmm.
Let's get through the impacts. Let's get through the storms themselves, and then we can talk all about the fine statistics and a hot wash collectively at the back end. Because as April mentioned earlier, 2023, we had 3 storms that made impact. We had 20 named storms overall. We've had 5 named storms this season. 5 have made impact. 3 hurricanes, I apologize, all have impacted someone. A generalized large area of land and highly populated areas. And I know for those of you who've watched previously, we've already exceeded, if not tripled upon, some of the thresholds such as property damage, loss of life, damage in general. So it goes without saying,
That's
they
right.
just all come in different shapes and sizes every hurricane season.
No question. And I think we'll leave it on this because I have to run and go do some things in the studio for our 11 o'clock news. And if you're in the greater Central Florida area, tune in tonight. We're going to be talking about the storms that continue around the Florida Peninsula. But Suzanne's talking about why can't they just say, we'll watch and see what happens with the season, because that's really all we can do anyway. And I bring this question over because David and I were literally talking about this about 2 hours ago. Okay, that some people believe there's not a point for these seasonal forecasts. I think there is a point for the seasonal forecast. This one may not be working out in the favor of most, if not all, forecast entities in terms of the number of named storms. The one thing, though, that we could clearly see, I think, and you can go back and look at the thumbnail and the video to prove it, and actually came out and said on this thing that I'll not call it an explosive season as a forecast entity that rhymes with smack you weather says. Nonetheless, we called it a more impactful season. It looked significant that we were going. Last year we had a bunch of storms, but they were all out at sea for the most part. Idalia, one of the big exceptions, of course. But we've already had minimal storms, but 3 of them a decently high impact. I mean, even with Debbie being only a Cat 1, there was big-time flooding in the Carolinas. So, again, I think it was clear anyway that these were going to be a lot closer to land than last year. And so far, that part of the forecast has turned out to be extremely accurate.
Oh, yeah, definitely. And some of the key takeaways here, folks, we're watching a feature in the western Gulf of Mexico. This is the same feature that was initially anticipated to develop into something a little more robust as it wandered through the central and western Caribbean. And for the sake of time, I'm just going to give you a timetable. Early next week is when we'll need to watch for any type of impacts with this orange blip down there that you can see on our tropical outlook right there over the next 7 days. 30% chance of development over the next 48 hours, 50% chance of development over the next 7 days. It does look like whatever does decide to manifest itself down there in the Bay of Campeche and ride north along the upper periphery, or I should say the southeast leading edge of another trough that's expected to dig down over the Great Plains into the Midwest, the southeast United States as well. This is likely to occur anywhere between Tuesday to Thursday of next week. The rainfall amounts are going to be what's long-winded, no pun intended, with this system. We'll have to kind of watch it day by day, track it real time to see how much of a chance it does have at organizing into Francine, or if this will just continue to bombard us with some pretty exceptional rainfall amounts, very similar to almost like a pseudo El Nino type pattern down there in the Gulf of Mexico, the upper Gulf coastline, and here in the Sunshine State of Florida. But that's all we got for you, ladies and gentlemen. Jonathan, if you want to go ahead and close us on out.
Alrighty, awesome. It's going to be so much fun working with David. He's an awesome person. We've been talking off and on for the last several months, more on than off. And this is going to be a great addition to the Pinpoint Weather Team out of Central Florida and beyond. As we continue collaborating and just talking. So if you are interested in getting more sound meteorological weather content, hit the subscribe button on the Just Weather page and on the Weather Center Nazario page. Both of those pages are tagged in the description, so go find that. Monday night, if you're interested, hit the subscribe button. David and I will be back for Tropics Watch Live, 8 p.m. Eastern. We'll talk about what this looks like after the weekend. We're going to know a lot more on it, and we'll see if there's anything biting on the long-range models, which have not been reliable, as I guess always is the case. But nonetheless, thank you guys so much for tuning in. We'll catch you on Monday, 8 p.m. Eastern for Tropics Watch Live.